God bless you all who are listening, who are joining in. Like, comment, and share. I'm excited, elated, grateful, thankful, all those put together to be interviewing, having this interview. See, Unc's already laughing at me. Having this interview with one of God's great preachers, but also an unc to me and a role model, Pastor Delvin. Reverend Doctor Delvin Atchison, the proud pastor of the Westside Baptist Church of Lewisville, Texas. Unc, thank you so much for joining us today.
You have honored me. It was worth coming on just to be introduced. I know I'm not all of that, but it sure felt good.
Oh my goodness! So, Unc, tell us, give us some background about you.
Well, I've been preaching for 40 years. I've been pastoring for 35. I took about a 4 or 5 year hiatus to do sort of corporate religion with Texas Baptist denominational work, and and got called back into the pastorate where my heart was.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, you said you're from Hearn, Texas, correct?
I'm from Hearn, Texas, a small town in
So,
central Texas, 20 miles north of Texas A&M.
so how was it growing up in Hearn?
Hearn was great. Hearn, because we're still in the Bible Belt, there was a very high level of biblicism. Church was well respected, and I had just a number of pastors who poured into me. It They were very affirming, and they saw in me what I did not see in myself. And I was blessed to have two amazing pastors, C.L. Simpson, L.R. Bullock, who were both Bible scholars. And part of the reason why I'm such a slave to the text is because of their investment in ministry. I learned how to tell stories from a guy who I thought is probably the best parable teller since Jesus, a guy named O.W. Matt. His son Delbert pastors in Beaumont. He showed me the importance of looking for preaching and life principles in everyday occurrences. I had a sense of dignity about the pulpit that I learned from a guy named C.M. Roach, who was the moderator. And he carried himself with such poise. One writer was describing Benjamin Mays. He said he walked with the princely prance of a man on his way to a meeting with himself. Uh, Roach kind of had that about him, and I wanted to embody that. A guy named R.C. Gentry, who at every opportunity gave me a chance to preach. And one of the earliest primary influences on my love of study was a pastor named Weldon Jackson. He insisted that I go to the pulpit with substance. And so I was affirmed by that great community. And I tell people, with the kind of loving parents that I had, I didn't have an excuse to be a failure. I'd have to go back and work hard to not be something. They put so much in me.
So, talk to us then. Talk to us then about when you talk about those early influences. Talk to us about the importance of having those influences as a young preacher, a young pastor.
You know, when I first started preaching, and Hearn produced preachers. There was a group they called the Coca-Cola parties, where a group of young adults would go from place to place and just study the Bible. And probably 15 preachers came out of that group, or they just uh, the desire to want to do more. And those early influences to encourage us to preach. So when we were around a lot of preachers, and particularly at that time when you were young, the first thing you do is when you do your first sermon, you get you some money, you go buy you some suits so you look like a preacher. Well, my cousin Weldon Jackson, who now lives with the Lord, Weldon told my parents he's going to sound like a preacher even if he doesn't look like one. And he had them to take the money from my first sermon and bought books. And he said to me early on, hooping was big, and I'm a big fan of celebration and preaching, though I've not attained it. He said, "You don't have a voice, Delvin. You can't rely on a gift." He said, "I want you to have so much Jesus in your sermon that at the end, if you say 'Boo Lord,' they're gonna shout." And so early on, he made sure that I had more substance than style.
Wow. So I think that's important, Unc, what you just said, talking about books, the importance of the library, the importance of the study, the importance of having that substance. Because and let me just say, you are a great closer. Let me just say it. You're a great closer.
Let the Lord use you to encourage the prophet. Amen.
You are a great closer, but anybody that has listened to you, like I have and so many others, your substance is so great. And so when you talk about reading and the need for knowledge and the need for that substance, when you look at preaching now, talk to us about what do you see in preaching now as compared to what you saw when you first started.
Oh, I'm the eternal optimist, and so when I look at these young minds who are um, being educated, and I don't think that laity should ever be burdened with ignorant clergy. I think
Mm,
it's a burden for them to have to endure that. When so the voices that influenced me growing up were pastors who had to be bivocational, and they would give themselves to study and made themselves available, and God would blow on what they would prepare. And uh, and and when I look at just the insight, the wisdom they have, and you and I have access to so much more, and what we offer ought to have greater depth, because if we start where they started, a generation was wasted. I know there are pastors in my group who are sometimes challenged or made uncomfortable by younger pastors. It is my desire that all of my sons and daughters in the faith would do more and better than I would. Uh, and so, in preaching today, I see a desire for more and for better. Now, there are some who go with this for a moment, this season, and you can get this season. I don't think that preaching ought to ever lose that element of otherworldliness. That this world is not a home. Our best days are not here. This is the best life ever. It might be the best so far, but it's not the best ever. Yeah, because if earth is the best there is, then heaven no longer is a desire. And so I think that preaching has to do that. What I think my if I had a desire or something to bequest, as it were, upon the generation of preachers that follow me, it is to reclaim the prophetic voice that is so central to African American preaching. African American preaching, at, at at its infancy and much of its formative years, was done from people who lived on the peripheral. They were outsiders, and they appreciated that dynamic tension that exists between the prophet and the king. They spoke truth to power. They called it out. With the election of Barack Obama, so many prophets worked to get the king on the throne, and rightly so. I think that I'm not sure we still understand that there's to be that tension between the prophet and the king, that we are
mm,
otherworldliness. We saw that lapse in evangelicalism with the election of Donald Trump, that they worked so hard to put a king on the throne that their prophets no longer spoke against the king. And so I hope that Black voices would recapture that prophetic voice. And I do think that the election of Donald Trump spurred us back to the prophetic voice. Not just this is your season, but what is God doing in his kairos, in the seasons and times of God. And to look at it through a perspective where I'm not just preaching to this congregation, but I'm speaking to this generation. And one of the things social media has done is it has made the generation in which we live, not the country in which we live, available to us. And it is important that we come with a prepared word. It's also important that you have a prepared word because people are listening to so many voices. There was a time when you only heard national preachers in national settings, and now you hear them every day. There was a time when somebody's favorite preacher was not their pastor. You know, they went to their church, but they would sneak off to hear so and so, listen to hear so and so when they were online. Now those people can attend that church every Sunday virtually, and their preacher becomes their favorite preacher can become their pastor. And so it's important that we have a prepared word. Uh, I think it's important that we have a prepared word also because people have information at their fingertips. Whatever they want to know. When I first, most of the voices I heard growing up, whatever they told me, I believed it. I couldn't Google it. And they told me the story, I had to believe it. I think part of recapturing prophetic voice is we had a Sunday school lesson. You're familiar with Sunday school, aren't you, Pastor?
Yeah.
We had a Sunday school lesson about Nathan and David. And I think part of the prophetic voice has to be um, a wit, an intellect to speak, not always angry,
Right.
but to speak inside. I think it requires that type of wit because if you're always mad, people just turn off angry people. They just shut you out.
Right.
But Nathan comes with this wit to say, and I think it requires an intelligence to raise those parallels. And I think that wit, but I think it also requires the courage to say, "Now, King, that's you." Oh, funny you should hear that, King. You are that man. Yeah.
Wow. Yes, sir. So, talk to us about your first sermon and then how you got called to your first church.
Okay, my first sermon, January 24th, which was a Super Bowl Sunday, 1982. It was second time around. Group named Shalimar. Um, Howard Hewitt, Jeffrey Daniels, and Jody Watley had done a song called Second Time Around, not like the first time. Boy, I almost started dancing right then. And and I did Second Time Around from the third chapter of John. Uh, Marvel not, you must be born again. And because the Cowboys weren't playing, all my friends came. My classmates came. I was a junior in high school. Back then, they used to have Super Bowl on the fourth Sunday in January, and so I uh, I did second time around, and it was interesting because if you preach your first sermon with me, I take you through a class. We go over your sermon about 5 or 6 times because I told my pastor what I wanted to preach. He gave me a date. I showed up and preached it. And man, I just thought this sermon was, I said, man, I'll be up here for 35, 40 minutes. Actually, I had gotten finished in about 10, 12 minutes, but I had been speaking since I was 9 and just doing church talks. And so I could kind of wing it. I started talking about everything I know. And then I, I hooped and cried a while and sat down. I hooped and cried a while. My first church was the Old Providence Church. I was a freshman in college, University of Texas, and my cousin again, Weldon, who kind of mentored me, had gotten a connection. I remember catching the bus home and going to preach, and my father would either drive me or let me use his car. And I was at the Old Providence Church, and they were gracious people and put up with what I thought was preaching. And that was in November of '83. And I had been privileged by my pastor when I started preaching. He would let me preach every fourth Sunday, which was the youth Sunday. And he let me preach. And I'm indebted for that.
So, how was those years at Old Providence? You said you're a freshman in college. How were
Freshman in
those? How were
college,
those? How was those years at Old Providence?
it was a learning experience. I think the thing I learned most was that in every situation, the hand of God is present. I had a wonderful deacon. My biggest challenge, I think, at Old Providence was I was 18 and my youngest deacon was 60. the youngest one,
Mm.
and they went up to their 90s. And for me to go there, I learned early on that the Lord sends us certain places, not just to teach the people, but to learn from them as well. And the hard reality is that you have to work your way up to a pastor, but God allows you to be the shepherd when you go there. And I learned how to shepherd people, to be concerned, to make investments. I learned there that there are some things God will give you that are not for where you are; they are for where you're going.
Woo.
You may be anointed king early on and have to leave your own anointing service and go sit on a stone, not a throne. You go to a
Wow.
pasture and not a palace. And so what you do is you tuck those
Wow.
things and say, when the season comes, I'll be ready to use them. And I think that that anointing is so that in times of drought you will remember what the oil felt like. And every young pastor who hears me, who says I'm not at that place, if where you are doesn't look like where God promised, your journey isn't over. If you can't pastor, preach until God gives you a place where you can pastor. I also learned that you got to you have to know people. My cousin who was mentoring me, and that's the importance of a mentor. Every pastor ought to have a pastor. My pastor is A.C. Stapleton of the Shekinah Tabernacle Baptist Church. He gets upset if I don't call his name. Uh,
A
but
great pastor, great
and he
preacher,
started early
great
on
preacher.
mentoring me later on at a church when after my pastor had died. Pastor Stapleton started mentoring me. But my cousin who was my mentor early on told me, he said, you've got to decide if you want work done or if you want to get credit for it. And he told me, he said, he said, when you get through talking he said, find out who the bell cow is. Now you're gonna know I'm from the country. The bell cow is the one they put the bell on, and they aren't elected. The other cows follow that bell cow because when the feeding truck comes, the bell cow is going, and there's something they get from the bell cow. Find out who runs that church. They may not hold any office, and go visit with them and share what your thoughts are. See how they feel about it. Sometimes you just have to say, "Oh man, that's a great thought." And when you leave, they don't know if they thought it or you said it. But make sure, and then just ask them, "Can I give you the credit for this?" Yeah.
And so, how was it working with deacons? As you say, your youngest deacon is 60 years old, and you're
Right.
18. How was
Right.
that?
Well, I would go and ask them their opinions. I couldn't raise them. I mean, there was little I could tell them, but I had been called, and and when it came to age, I was as old as the Holy Spirit because I had access to His wisdom. But I went with the understanding that this was a place to preach and to develop a gift, to learn and to love, and didn't go try to boss. If I off, if we get our egos out of the way, and every preacher has to have some kind of ego. You have to. I mean, why else would you have the audacity to say you speak for God? I mean, there's a presumption there, and and you have to get your ego out of the way and say, okay, if you don't want to do what I tell you, I've done my part. God holds me responsible for sharing. He holds the congregation responsible for the response.
Wow. But help us out, because there may be young pastors watching, young pastors listening, or even other pastors listening. Because you said something I think is very important, how you can be at a place, but then you have to come to that realization, as you say, this may not be your final destination, but you have these dreams, you have these goals you want to achieve, but it's like you have, when you come to that realization that you're more or less here to preach and teach
Well,
instead of really pastoring.
right. Well, spend that time developing your gift. Listen, read, work out those plans, even if they are not there. If they don't want to receive them, get them so detailed that when your opportunity comes, you'll be ready to put them in place. what happens with a great many of us is God will give us dreams. God will give us uh, hopes, aspiration, plans, and we just put them away because they're not going to do it. I'm going to forget about it. Langston Hughes laments about a dream deferred. Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat or crust over with a syrupy sweet? Does it sag like a heavy load or just explode? Now, notice he does not talk about a delayed dream. He talks about a deferred dream. Your present place may delay your dream, but only you can defer it.
Woo!
You've got to decide if you're going to put it off for some. While while conditions have your dream delayed, start working that dream out. Start making the plans. Preach. And I think every pastor ought to prepare like God is going to take them somewhere else in the sense that they train somebody to do what they do. So that if they died tonight, the ministry wouldn't stop. But every pastor ought to work like they're going to be in this place forever.
Yes, sir. My, you helping us today, Unc. You helping us. You're helping us. You're
I'm going to
helping.
put my
So let me
cash
ask.
app up in a minute and let y'all.
And so you're at Old Providence, my fault. For how many years?
I was there for 6 years.
So then talk to us about your transition to was it Antioch? Was Antioch the next
No,
church?
I left Old
Okay.
Providence and went to Progressive Baptist Church in Cameron. And Progressive it was the leading quote unquote black church there. Some of the people I had worked with in the NAACP. They had a real civic minded ministry, and not in a bad way, mind you, but they were real civic conscious. And so I was there 2 years and left and went to Crockett. I stayed in Crockett 11 years. Then I went to the Antioch church. So the interesting thing is I have only wanted to leave one church. And when I say that, I mean every other time. And even then, I did not go candidating for a church. I mean, it kind of happened. And I don't knock that. People do. I've been unusually fortunate that churches have sought me. God and God does that always. I think providentially. It's a new day, and churches elect pastors a new way. I was approached by a headhunter organization that said, "Hey, this church is open. They're interested." But the one church I wanted to lead was we had done a program, and it was a youth program. And at that time, I was real involved with college ministries. And several of the guys, my friends who had taught in college ministries, came to the church. We gave them envelopes with honorariums. They gave them back. And one of the chairman said to me, his wife was the financial secretary, so you know what kind of situation this is. And he said to me, I said, we've got to do this if we want to grow. And he looked at me and said, "Who told you that we wanted to grow? We like being the size we are." And for me, I asked the Lord to relieve me. But every place else, it wasn't until I got really comfortable being there that the Lord said, "Okay, it's time to move." And when I say really comfortable, I don't mean in the sense that I wasn't productive. It means it was kind of where I wanted it to be. And the Lord said, "Okay, I've got another move for you."
And so when you talk about and Unc, when you talk about candidating, because I know there are a lot of those who have been approached. There are a lot of those who have been approached to become pastors by approach, but there are many who will candidate. There are many who will send a resume, and
Mhm.
sometimes for some that can be discouraging because we all know the famous letter you get. Thank you for sending, but we go in a different direction. So how would you encourage those who are listening about, in a sense, waiting on God, but also in a sense, I still want to at least try by writing out the application or submitting a resume?
It's an old quote by George Mueller that says, And not only are the steps of a good man ordered by the Lord, but the stops of a good man are ordered by the Lord. Where God doesn't want you, he won't allow you to go. And if you are in tune with his spirit, he will let you know. Now, you may bother him until he allows you to get in a place, and you will understand why he doesn't want you there. I'm comfortable with guys who candidate. I'm comfortable, with churches who you do it with the understanding that whatever you do, you know, follow God's guidance. Because I think the spirit can work as effectively with a resume as you can with a reference. Somebody say, hey, y'all need to listen to so and so.
Wow. My. And so you said you were in Crockett for 11 years?
Okay, I lost your volume there.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Maybe that was
Can
me.
you hear me? Okay, can you hear me? Hold up, y'all. Hold up. We got to keep this going. Can you hear me now? Can you hear me? Can you hear me? I think he had a phone call. Can you hear me? Y'all don't leave. Don't leave. We just had a volume issue. Don't leave. Don't leave. Hold on. All right, can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? All right, hold on. Y'all don't leave. We just had a technical. Okay.
Oh. All right.
All right, I got you now. Yeah, I got you now. I got you.
You're much better. It may have been that phone.
Okay. I told people, I said, don't leave us. Don't leave us. So yeah, all right. But now you said you were in Crockett for 11 years, right?
11 years.
So in those 11 years, now what did you learn in Crockett that helped you for your next stop?
Well, Crockett was an interesting place, right? About 10,000 people. Bethel Church, where I served, was really one of the oldest Black churches in Texas. Blacks had been freed in June of 1865. That church was organized in October of 1865. We had, Crockett had two Black mayors, and both of them had been members of that church. A councilwoman. I was blessed to have a television show, local access, which went around to thousands of homes. And the interesting thing for me, as I look in the progression of my ministry, is that at Crockett, God really blessed our youth ministry. We had a group called Atchison Angels. The Atchison Angels had 123 kids in it. I mean, which is phenomenal for something that size. We traveled from Crockett to San Antonio and took 90 people. Crockett, I learned how to pastor. I mean, to shepherd, but also administer. Crockett helped me to become a much better pastor administratively, to assume an authority. I was getting older, and I became more respected. It was one of the toughest places to leave because I had been blessed to touch so many lives. These young people who left, I would go to the school and visit. I announced at the basketball game. I was on a football talk show, really invested in the community. My wife and I were on the chamber, worked with the city council. My brother-in-law was the chief of police, in Crockett. Now my sister-in-law is now the mayor. I mean, so I was blessed to be in Crockett. Had a wonderful chairman who just covered me. And in retrospect, I see that he covered me while I learned to pastor. I kind of grew up. And Pastor Stapleton, my pastor died, and Pastor Stapleton became my mentor and kind of just guided me through on how, particularly in the African American context of pastoring, but there's a certain authority given to the pastor. and how not to hold that loosely.
And so you said in Crockett, you really learned how to pastor.
Right.
And so, but when you get to that place where you, as you said, it was hard to leave. You know,
Mm-hmm.
your emotions start to get there. And for some may feel this challenge of working hard in a rural area, trying to grow a church in a rural area as compared to in a city. You know, what were some keys that you use that would help somebody else?
So Crockett had 10,000 people.
Mm-hmm.
Claiborne Lee really is an example that you don't have to be in a city. Now his city
Right.
is much larger than these places. But Clay said one time, you don't have to be in. You can have an urban ministry in a suburban setting, and I think the
Mm-hmm.
same thing is true about rural. That God is unlimited to where He can bless you.
Right.
Now, if you're in a place where you know you got 300 people, you got 7 people who are still coming to church, and the church is on the decline, I think there are some realities that set in. But God can do amazing things, and Crockett was that way. Uh, I mean, we had 2 services. I had a my early service in Crockett was called Morning Glory, and people from all other churches came because we had the only one. We had a television show, and just before, and I preached all over the country from Crockett. I was active in the national, you know, and and we had just remodeled the church. We had just bought a passenger 42 seat passenger bus. My wife and I had just remodeled our home, and the Lord said, "Okay, it's time to go to Antioch." And I knew God had never had to remodel a house or a church, and so He wouldn't understand. So I was going to cut the Lord a little bit of slack. And I'll never forget. Uh, I went to preach in Waco, and the people, the chairman, had the secretary of deacons to call me about Antioch, and I remember my ego kind of kicked in. I was getting ready, so they asked me to come preach. I went preach. They asked me to come back. I was going to preach for uh, Pastor Earl Pleasant in California, LA, and I said, "Hey, I'll preach. I'll come back on a night service." And I didn't think they had night service, so I said, "Well," I said, "Well, they had a night service for me." And what finally convinced me to go was I was preaching for Pastor James Glenn at St. Mark Church, and the Lord said as audibly to me as I am saying to you, "Did you call me or did I call you? Do you
Mm,
work for me or do I work for you?" When
mm,
he got through saying that, Jim's choir did, "Is your all on the altar of sacrifice laid?
my
Your heart
goodness.
has the spirit control." And I just started crying.
Wow.
And at the end of church, my wife said to me, "We're going to Waco, aren't we?" And what people don't understand
Whew.
is collectively, my wife and I probably took about a $30,000 pay cut to leave Crockett to go to Waco, Texas.
Wait, how much?
Probably $30,000 collectively.
My
But she was
goodness.
the director. She was the director of counseling for the school district, and I was a counselor at the junior high and a pastor. The next year, we had just planned we were going to build 24 apartments, and I was going to become the director of the Economic Development Corporation, which would have been an additional income. And the Lord sent us to Waco, and at Waco, He prepared me for a global ministry in a real sense. And
Wow.
whereas in Crockett, I perfected pastoring in Waco, I worked on my preaching. I can't say I perfected it.
No, I'll say it for you. You did. I'll say it for you. You did.
It was.
I'll say it for
It is.
you.
Well, I can say it is at least a glorious failure, and I can't wait to fail again.
But
You know.
I will say my first time hearing you, and I think and I've told you this before because I remember when you were at Texas Baptist, we had this conversation. My first time hearing Uncle Dell, he preached at Pilgrim Rest. It was an annual day, and I never forget because Pastor Wallace preached that morning. He preached from Ecclesiastes 4 verse 4. What drives you? And I remember you were in the balcony, and I remember you walked and you were in the office, and then you got up to preach. And I never will forget it, because one thing that those who have heard Uncle Delv know, that Uncle Delv is gonna tell a story at the beginning to open up and get you to his text. So I never forget, Uncle Delv preached about the woman with the issue of blood, but he said, when God lets you cut in line. That's one of the best sermons I've ever heard. And then
You gotta listen to more preaching. You gotta, oh
no, no,
man.
no, no. And then when you preach that, and then of course you celebrated, and I heard you. I was amazed by, just how scholarly. Because of course, when I'm a young preacher, I just started. I really didn't appreciate it then like I do now. So to hear you, it was amazing. So when you talk about Antioch, talk to us about that experience at Antioch.
Antioch was a great experience, right? So Antioch. So whereas in Crockett, youth were a major emphasis. Working with them at Antioch, the Lord blessed us to just work with a lot of college people.
Right.
I met Paul Powell, and they had an African American preaching conference, and Paul Powell, who was at that time dean, said that African American preaching was the most authentic preaching being done in pulpits anywhere in the world. He said it several times, and so I started having breakfast with him because I affirmed. He was so affirming to black preaching, and we were at breakfast one day, and I said, you know what, Dean, I'm going to encourage all the young men uh, who are going to seminary to come here because of the way you feel about preaching. He and Paul Powell was rather flippant and real blunt. He said, Delvin, you're like the fellow who's going to be a general and won't join the army. You come to seminary. I said, Renee put him in seminary, and Renee was his assistant dean, and we would meet. And I got to lecture at that conference because Joseph Parker heard me. Joseph Parker heard me. I was speaking to a group of about 12 people. I didn't even know Joseph Parker, but he was listening. And I tell preachers, and I say that so I could tell you, do your best wherever you are. And I thought it was just going to be, local guys coming. They had the 3 of the 4 National Baptist presidents there, and I lectured on preaching because Joseph made that investment in me. I got to preach on a national level because I was preaching to about 20 people, and Earl Pleasant heard me. Do your best because you don't know who God has in the audience, and sometimes you're tempted to coast. And even if there was not someone who we thought was a person of esteem, know that God sits in every empty seat. Do your best. And so I got to go to, and when I went there, I met Joe Gregory. We developed a friendship. He poured into me. David Garland, who was the dean, Hewlett Glower, and they became friends. Todd Steele, who's the dean now. And I had the opportunity to get them all to preach at Antioch, as well as to develop my gift and to go. I got exposed to the best minds there were in the world, Gardner Taylor, Forbes, whoever you would consider preachers of the day, Craddock, Tom Long, Calvin Miller, Ben Witherington. And because I was old, when they would come, I would often host them. So I got to pick their minds. And it was just a phenomenal time. And I got them to come over to my church. Had one of the few African Americans at that time who had a PhD in Old Testament. Dr. Reed was a member of my church. And what Antioch did for my preaching, so our college ministry just blew up. We had 150 students from Baylor, but I also had seminarians. I had a PhD in Old Testament who was a member, and a guy who was getting his PhD in New Testament, and a girl who was white who was getting her PhD in theology. And I was preaching to them on Sundays. And so what it did was it had me up on my game.
Yes, sir.
There are certain things that preachers will say that only other preachers will appreciate. And, to have that affirmation was a true joy. And so I kind of, so I developed what my preaching is, which I think is, my preaching is kind of a black hermeneutic with a white homiletic that's been baptized in the black church. It's been baptized. It's and and one of the things that I caution young brothers about who go to seminary is you got to be careful, particularly at white seminaries, that they don't completely dismiss all that the black church has brought to spiritual formation. There was nothing early on when I went to Truett that affirmed what the black church had placed in me. And so we started a spiritual formation group. We started the Truett Black Student Association. We had a group for pastors, and I tell people that what the black church poured, Truett polished,
Yes,
and they
sir.
kind of finished off what was formational. But I had, I and I think that's true with most seminary students because the black church still doesn't trust uh, the academy
Yes,
to be
sir.
foundational. If you went to seminary, you probably preach 4 or 5 times more than your white counterpart.
Right.
Because them, they'll say, we want to be a preacher. Okay, you go to seminary. When you come back, we'll license you. Black church say, let us license you, get you with the preacher. Now you go off to seminary to learn.
Right. And talk to us then, Uncle, about the importance of seminary education.
So seminary is like college in the sense that it opens you to think. Uh, I tell people that seminary stretches and tests your core values so that you can defend them well. I jokingly say if you're not an atheist for at least 6 months, you're not really going to seminary. You got at least agnostic for a month and a half. But
Apologetics did that for me.
yeah, I mean, it challenges you so you can defend. And Paul encouraged us to always be ready to give a defense. There are so many things you can learn just about text, authorial intent, uh, the languages if you take them. They teach you so much administration because there's no place to learn that, and you
Right.
can learn those in seminary. And I tell preachers it's the difference between seeing things in black and white and getting a 4K UHD, whatever the latest one is. Sitting here with an antenna and a black and white TV, or going in while you're streaming at 8,000 billion million megahertz. You see so much, and You're able to talk about as much getting to your text as most people are by the time they're finished.
Mm, my. And then Unc spent a good amount of time at Antioch, and then the Lord opened up a door for him to be at Texas Baptist, and then Westside. So talk to us, Uncle, about those transitions.
So I really think it. The, I had a friend when I was in Waco who heard me preach for a pastor's anniversary, David Harding. And David became, at that time, he was the executive director for the district association. And then he became the director of development for Truett. David had been a pastor and a journeyman. And then he became the executive director for Texas Baptist. Well, David and I had developed a friendship, and I knew him to be a man of incredible integrity and just a good man. And we had been friends. So when he went to Texas Baptist, when he reshaped, reformed Texas Baptist, he restructured is a better word. He asked me if I'd come um, be over the Great Commission team, and they had never had an African American director. And his thing was he wanted me to be a person of integrity. I trust you. I trust your preaching. And so I had to leave. I had to leave because it was a full-time job, and it was a challenging time because I had to alter relationships that had been dear. I had never. Um, I had always been a pastor from the time I was 18, and I was like 50 then, and yeah, I was 50 then, and man, I that's all I knew. It wasn't what I did. It was who I was, and and took I took the opportunity to go to Texas Baptist and told the church, and I was blessed because I did not leave at a time of challenge. Right? They had just given me like this major 50th birthday party, right? Where they had, I mean, and they were extremely generous to their pastor. We had it at the Baylor Club, and I had to tell them the next Sunday. Well, I wanted to tell them I got offered the day before the party. I couldn't tell them that Sunday. But
No.
I had to wait till all the checks cleared. Amen. And, and no, and the Lord told me to go, and I was worried because I said I'm gonna be a jackleg. I'll be over here. People gonna think I'm a sellout, and the Lord allowed me to be true to who I was. Michael Evans, who had been over African American ministries, told me, "Go in being a man. Go in not with them understanding that you had a job when they came got you." And David, I don't know that I've ever worked in such an affirming place, ever had such an affirming boss as David Hardage. I had a wonderful team, a guy named Phil Miller, who was my executive, who was my associate director, and the team just worked. I was the only black director, and I was able to keep my blackness, and God just opened up doors for me to preach, literally around the world. And David has such an amazing ability. He said to me, "Now you are becoming the voice and the face of Texas Baptist. You are the voice and the face. My my primary job was evangelism by proclamation." And I said to David, "I may be the voice. It may be my voice, but it will always be your vision." And it was just an honor to work. And then Westside came and asked me about being interim. And my wife and I would travel. I mean, man, I was in an airplane probably 8 times a month, right? Right. It was like that. I was somewhere else every Sunday, and my granddaughter had just moved back to Dallas. And when Westside came, hey, we know you're not interested, but would you come? And so I went, and I went. I'd never been interim, and intentional interim isn't a lot. We don't do that a lot in the Black church. And I went over there, and one of the guys said to me, he said, "We don't need an interim pastor. We need a pastor in the interim." And they had experienced some hurt, gone through some challenges, and I felt God turning my heart. I had everything I could want at Texas Baptist, and apparently I didn't pray hard enough because the Lord wanted me to come back with some meetings and all this other kind of stuff that you have to put up with. But God just turned my heart to the people, and turned their hearts to me, and it was so good because they knew what they were getting.
Right.
Their church had experienced hurt, and I had known hurt. And I tell guys, most of the places I had been, jobs I had, my strengths got me there.
Right.
I think it was my weaknesses that helped me pastor at
Yes,
Westside.
sir.
I knew what it felt like to experience pain and just love them through it. And they allowed me to pastor them in the interim and asked me if I would come on.
Wow. And so how long you been at Westside?
I've been there 3 years. Yeah.
Wow. And I remember, I know a lot of us remembered when you got the call to be interim, then when you got the call to pastor, it's like just a blessing for you. And I remember when you were at Texas Baptist, I mean, it's like every Sunday you were somewhere preaching, every week
Every week.
you were somewhere preaching. But I think something is interesting because there are those who will be approached to be an interim pastor, to carry on services, preaching and teaching, but in their heart they feel maybe this could be something, but then there's a hesitancy because some churches basically say nope, interim, period.
Well,
But then
that had been kind of the rule at Westside. If you're an
right,
interim, and that was why I was comfortable going. But somebody said if you really want to make God laugh, let him know your plans. And I had planned to retire from Texas Baptist, and apparently that wasn't on God's calendar. I tell guys who fight to get to places like Westside that what God has for you, it really is for you. And guys will say, well, you can say it because you're there, but I haven't always been there. Guys thought I became an overnight sensation at Texas Baptist. Well, you had been listening to me preach for years before I went to Texas Baptist or the Westside. And you have to prepare your gift where you were. We were talking to somebody, and a guy was telling me, your name is this, you're doing that. And one of my sons, Pastor Henry Batson, said, showed me some notes that he had from me in 1995. None of us are overnight sensations. God brings us to seasons where we are prepared, and then he allows us to go to places. When I went to Antioch, when I went to Westside, I was at Texas Baptist, I was comfortable. And so it freed me during the interim to be real. Because if they didn't like me, if they didn't want me, I had someplace else to preach. And it freed me to love on them. And they got to see who I was without any facade. And when the possibility came open that if I was going to be pastor, it was an interesting dynamic because I said to them, if I'm going to be the candidate, I'll be the only one. And you'll vote me either up or down. Because it was unfair. I don't care who had come. If Paul and Jesus had come back and preached as candidates, I'm baptizing these people's children. I'm performing their weddings. I'm sitting by them or preaching their parents' funeral. And it's like a lady is dating two guys, one buying the kids Christmas gift, feeding them, and they said, now which one do we marry? And so it was unfair. And I really went there with the idea. I said, there's going to be some young cat going to come in here, and I'm going to help him, and they going to go, and I'll go back to Texas Baptist. And the Lord said, this is what I want for you. And it was the kind of church that you dream of. I'd always dreamed of. And God did it. He placed me there. And I said, I'll come, but I'll be the only candidate. And if you decide you don't want me, I'll still work just as hard to put somebody else in you. And I was sincere about that. I really meant that. And ended up, the Lord, blessed me. I had to have 75% of the vote. I think we got like 98%.
Wow.
And I tell people, I got about 32%. Because they like my wife, she got the other 66%. They knew they could get the real Dr. Atchison, and they just put up with me. Yeah, and so I owe her that. And on payday, she never lets me forget.
Yes, sir. But you said something very key, I think, when you said, if I'm gonna come, I'm doing this, I'm doing that, I'm gonna be the only candidate. And you say be real, because in a sense, sometimes a person can be the interim and they're doing all of this, and then next thing you know, the church goes in a different direction, basically tells the interim.
Well, when I came as interim, I had no intentions to pastor. And I went there to do what an interim does. The only time I said I'm going to be the only candidate is when they approached me about being a candidate. When they approached me about being a candidate, then I said, I'll be the only candidate, or I won't be a candidate, because I wasn't going to get into a contest with somebody else.
Right.
Because if they had called somebody else, it would have been unfair to them to have to put up with people who wanted me to be pastor. And I didn't want that for whoever came. And so I just said, I'll be, and even if you don't want me to be your pastor, it's not like I'm going to be homeless or I'm not going to have a place to preach. Because I was at Texas Baptist, and God had really kissed me at Texas Baptist. I'm on the 8th floor with a corner suite. And so, and just when you think this is the pinnacle, it can't get any better than this. God says, let me show you what I have for you. And I think the journey to Texas Baptist was to show me administration on another level,
Yes, sir.
on handling $1 million budgets and staff, so that when I went to a Westside, I wouldn't be overwhelmed. And let me say this for young pastors: be careful what you keep bothering God for, because He may give it to you and you're not ready for it,
Mm,
and you'll be destroyed. You'll be afraid to take it when you would have been ready, right?
mm.
So, a kid can love how pretty a Hummer is, but you give them the keys and you put them in danger and everyone else.
Wow.
Yeah.
So talk to us just for a few minutes, Uncle, about just the importance of being a strong administrator.
It is so important. The most challenging experiences I've had in ministry uh, had to do with administration. And so I thought, you know, if you love the people, you're a good preacher, but it's good. Ain't nobody gonna try nothing with the church. And I was lacking in that area. And you have to stay on top of administration because the buck stops with you. Uh, Church isn't just a business, but there is a business element of church. And to be an effective pastor, you've got to be an effective administrator. And if there are areas that you are weak in, surround yourself with people whose strengths are in those areas, right? And set up checks and balances. I don't control everything in Westside. There's some people that are still, I'm not pastor, but I oversee what happens at Westside
Yes, sir.
because I have to answer to the people I do pastor. I owe them that, but even more, I've got to answer to God that I don't allow us to do things that would bring dishonor to His name.
Yes, sir. And you just said something. You oversee what happens at
Hmm.
Westside, but you answer to the people who let you pastor them.
They let you, because you have to. You can't make nobody. So, and there are some pastors who want to control everything. E.K. Bailey said one time, if you know everything that goes on in your church is way too small. You can't, you won't know, and you can't control it because you can have either control or growth. You can't have both
Right.
because you have to keep it small enough for you to control it. And I've heard guys tell me, well, I'm going to be on it. I'm going to know. You don't know what's said in the Sunday school class if you're not there.
Right.
Right. And so you got to trust that the Lord is still in charge.
Yes, sir. My goodness. And so, just for a quick, couple of quick hitters, talk to us before we let you go, because you've been more than generous with your time today. This has been like a blessing, like you have no idea. If we look at these comments, who's you've been blessing that you've been
I've
blessing
been
all of
honored
us.
by my hate. I couldn't see them. I've been honored. And
So, so talk to us then, Unc, about just some advice you would give to young pastors, young preachers, whether it's preaching, lifestyle, any of those
so,
things.
so Mac, I don't know if you're familiar with Dr. Mac King Carter.
Uh
Mac King Carter was arguably one of the most animated preachers of our generation.
huh.
He
Yes,
really
yes,
pushed
sir.
us to come out of our comfort zone, right? So one of the things that Dr. Carter did one time, Dr. Carter said, and he was talking. He said, "There's a man down in Florida where I'm from, and he say he was ugly as sin, but he had a voice so sweet, you get diabetes listening to him." And then Dr. Carter would say, "But he couldn't outsing his living."
Mm,
Young friends, you cannot preach your living. And I'm old now. There's some decisions life has made for me. Some stuff I'm not bothered with. But at least be as discreet as you can. There is, I think, inherent in contemporary intelligence an arrogance that says we are smarter than the people who've come before us. because we know what they know plus all the new stuff. Be careful, because even though your journey started with you, your story did. You are the next chapter in a book we help write.
Wow.
And you've been handed a rich legacy
Wow.
in preaching.
Wow.
Uh, and do all you can to uphold that. If I could tell preachers to do anything, it's part of one of the things that I'm really working hard at trying to do. It is to get preachers to partner in their preaching. You know, I'm working on developing cohorts where guys just talk, where guys just talk and say, hey, man, what are you preaching about? I'm doing this, da da da. Because we're so busy trying to pioneer, and we came too late for original thought. Get with some guys who will hold you to a degree of accountability. Just share your hearts. You know, do a series with each other. Say, hey, man, let's get to four of us, and we'll work. We'll get together on Monday and talk about what we're going to preach on Sunday. Find you some people who stretch you. Yeah.
Yes, sir. And so, wow, that's amazing. And also, talk to us about pastors and preachers who about just continue to preach, because we live in a culture where, you know, we see those of our comrades, our brethren, who will be on national stages and different things like that, and there are those who would like to have those national stages. And, you know, just talk to us about, you know, about continuing to preach even if you
So
don't ever get there.
I tell every preacher this, and there may be I don't want to be a hypocrite. Uh, it was always my desire to be an effective preacher, and one of the byproducts of that was I got to be popular to some preachers. You got to decide whether you want to be popular or effective, and not that the two can't coexist, but you got to decide what's important. You know, it's interesting that nothing good is said about pride in the Bible. And if you want to get up there, really just think, why do I want to get up there? Is it because I can preach as good as that person? Well, that won't change. You're still as good a preacher. Do you need the national affirmation for that? Or is it, I want them to see what I got? Well, is that why God gave you the gift? And I don't want to sound like I'm superhuman, humble, da 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 da. I mean, I think I've been gifted by God. But for me to brag about that gift is like somebody with a rental car bragging about what they're driving. I've been given a gift that I got to return, and I've got to give an account of how I handle it. You just prepare and seek to be effective. You know, one of the burdens that a friend helped to lift from my shoulders was when I was preaching in Waco. I would have 12, maybe 15 seminarians on any given Sunday, and every Sunday I wanted to knock it out the park. I wanted them to hear me and go back and tell their professor, "Oh, you need to go hear this preacher." And I was talking to Joel Gregory, and Joel Gregory, of all people, said to me that I didn't, Delvin, be careful, that I didn't have to knock it out the park. He said, just be true to the text and share with the people insight. Because what I don't discourage desire. I have a desire. I always wanted to be the preacher's preacher. I always wanted to be the preacher that other preachers wanted to hear, right? And but one of the dangers of that, if you're not careful, is you'll prepare sermons. Uh, you'll make plates for giraffe, and all the sheep will starve to death.
Mm.
Because a giraffe can bend its neck down and eat. And so I have in years worked not to use my gifts. I love words. I think they're the tools of our trade. Nobody ever says to a plumber, "You have too many wrenches." Nobody ever says to a carpenter, "You gonna buy another hammer?" I think preachers ought to have. I think preachers ought to have as many tools as they can and those are your words. But I think we should work hard on making the gospel as simple as we can. And Jesus spoke, and the common people heard him gladly.
Yes, sir. Well, Uncle, is there anything else that's on your heart? Anything else you want to share?
And I am so excited about preaching. I
Y-
so I hear all people scared and people talk about what young preachers are doing. Man, y'all are doing this thing. I am so excited. I'm at the season now, and I tell people I don't think I'm in the fourth quarter, but I think I'm in the second half. You know, I'm trying to run these last laps in a way that would make the Lord proud. But I am so excited to hand off what I hope will be a heritage worth giving to you, because I think you will leave such a profound legacy. And I'm in the afternoon excited because I see what's in the morning, and y'all are doing a great job. And the joy of my life now, I tell my wife, is I'm getting more sons and daughters in the faith. I One writer said, and Brugman said this. He said, "We all want our children to have our faith, but we also want our faith to have some children."
mm.
I have lived long enough to see my faith have children, and it is the joy of my life.
Yes, sir. Well, like I said, I'm just grateful that have always been kind to me and accepted me. And, anytime I need to talk to you, I have, and you've shared so much with me. So, as always, I'm grateful for you.
Well, you're pastoring now, aren't you?
Yes, sir.
Oh, I didn't know I hadn't preached there. And with that cut, DA says, I'm out of here. Love you, boy.
Love you all. Have a good
Oh,
one.
don't love
Well, God bless you. Thank y'all for tuning in. Pray you've been blessed today. Continue to like, share, and comment. And we look forward to seeing you next time with another Clergy Conversation.